We're back with part 2 of our Prusa MMU3 multi-material unit series, where we take it all the way from parts to awesome multi-material prints. Hello everybody, Chris here. We're taking a look at the Prusa MMU3. That's a multi-material unit you can add on to your Prusa 3D printer to allow you to use 5 different materials and one single nozzle to create multi-material prints. In the last video, we pretty much got all of the MMU3 assembled. There's a few things we need to finish up, but we also talked about the printed parts and everything you were going to need to be successful. Now today we're going to move on to the filament buffer. We have to assemble that. I'll show you how you're going to utilize it and what it's for, and then we'll move on to the printer. There's a handful of parts we need to update to be compatible with the MMU3. Most of it's focused around the filament sensor and how it will be utilized to talk back to the MMU3 so that you have some error checking, so you don't lose any filament while you're trying to achieve all of this goodness. Now, it is important to note that the MMU3 is currently compatible with the 2.5 series of printer, as well as the Mark III series. All of those should be able to work with the MMU3 today. Soon there will be support for the Mark IV. It's a completely different extruder setup, so they're still working all of that out. But the MMU3 unit itself that we're focused on here is going to be pretty much identical. There might be a few different parts as far as the printer is concerned, but everything I'm going to show you should go for whatever printer model that you might want to install it on. So let's go ahead and jump in. We'll finish up our assembly on the MMU3, and then we'll move to all that other good stuff. So back at our MMU3, exactly where we left off in the last video, we're going to talk about cable management here. It is more important than you might think. You don't want to have the cables too constrained because some of these do have to move around, like your sensor here. But also you want them out of the way in case there are moving parts. You will have to open this door from time to time for maintenance, so you don't want to pinch any wires in that process. It's important where all of these cables are running from the motors as well, so we'll double check all of that. So as I said before, the first thing we need to verify is that we have enough slack on our fenda probe here, the one that checks the filament, before we start zip tying things down. This has to be able to move all the way over to this side, and the routing for it is done over here. So make sure there's enough slack so that we don't crimp that cable. So just kind of hold it where it needs to be, and I suggest you move it back and forth a few times just so that it never pulls on that cable. It's okay to have just a little bit of extra slop in it. Just make sure when it gets down to that end that it doesn't tug. So that's pretty good. So once you're good with that, that's going to be our first zip tie. We're just going to keep that distance with a zip tie right here, attaching it to the selector motor cable. Then we'll go ahead and bring that on around. Your pulley motor should be going out the back already, but we'll just put all 3 of those together with another zip tie right after that motor. Make sure you have your textile wrap on your power and your data wires already. We did that in the last video. But we'll just continue that on around. There are spots up here for zip ties that will help you put things in their place. But we'll take our wires for our 2 motors and our probe. We'll pull all that up with our power and data wires, and we'll secure it. Then we'll continue on with this 3rd hole down here with a zip tie. And we'll bring in any excess wire from that idler motor. You can just kind of loop it over itself, and we'll secure that. And just to make sure that that idler motor doesn't get hooked on anything, it's out of harm's way, I like to use one more down here on the end to attach it to the power and data cable, just to make sure it's nice and safe. Not the best job I've ever done, but having it up here on this cover is going to keep it out of the way, so in case you do have to open it up for maintenance, you'll be in good shape. Now we can move on to installing our final printed parts. We have the front cover here, and the mounts that actually put it on top of the printer. We'll need some M3x10s and some square nuts. On the MMU2 unit, we've got a couple of slots for square nuts on both sides. We've got 2 over here. These are for the mounting arms. 1 there. 1 over here. I suggest you do a side at a time because those do like to jump out of there. And both the frame holders are the same. You just want to make sure that front hole is to the front part of the unit, so they go like this. And you can use M3x10s to attach them to those square nuts. And then we can flip it around. These two square nuts we would have put in before we installed the motors. We did all those steps. Just make sure they're in there. Ours look good, so we can put another hanger on. M3x10s. Our frame holders are on. I can't say it enough, but double and triple check as you're going here that all of your square nuts are in place. They do like to fall out. I tried to show you in order the best way to avoid that, but sometimes it does happen. And then finally, we have our front cover that goes across right here. It just threads into the plastic. It doesn't have to hold anything. It's just to give you an indication of where the selector's at. Those go on with M3x10s. And there is the unit assembled, ready to go. But we're not done yet. Now we need to talk about PTFE. It is an important part to this kit. Now, these tubes here, you get 10 of them in this kit. These aren't the usual 4x2 that you see. They have a 4mm outer diameter, but if you can take a look, the inside diameter is just a little bit bigger. The ID is 2.5. And that allows you to pull that filament back after it's been rammed to put a tip on. It's going to be a little larger. This just makes things so much easier when you have just a little bit bigger tube. So if you have to swap out something in the future on your MMU3, make sure that you realize that these tubes aren't the standard 2x4 size. So from the back of the unit, we're just going to install 5 of our tubes. All 10 should be the same length, but just press them in. You're going to have to press them in pretty firm. There's that. And then if we flip it over, we can open the door. And in my opinion, one of the best things about the MMU3 versus the MMU2 is that you can open the door up, and they've designed the electronics cover to be over the top of those screws so that the screws don't fall out. That's a bigger upgrade than you might think, but it really gives you a headache to have to chase these screws and springs if they were to fall. But from here, you have a sight hole right here that you can see the end of that PTFE tube to let you know that it's in far enough. So if you take a look right here, this first one, I'll push it in, and you should be able to see the very tip of that PTFE tube when it's seated correctly. Let me get some light. You can see those first 3 are good, and then 4 and 5 need a little help. You can see the tubes down in there. It's easier in person. And then you can see this one down here, the tube's not in. So I'll go ahead and push on number 2 there, give it a little help, and then it slides into where it needs to be. And we'll just give number 1 there a little bit of help. Now they're all in place. I don't know if you can see light through the tube there, but now you can see that all of them are seated. So verify that. That can give you a lot of problems if you don't have those seated correctly. Now we can go ahead and put the door screws back on. This is a great time to go ahead and make their final adjustment. And there's an adjuster here where you can actually see what the screw head's doing. You want both of the screw tensions to be identical. And they don't have to be very tight at all. You want that screw head just above that printed part. Right there. Same for the other side. Right about there is more than tight enough. And you can see that still gives you plenty of tension on the door. That's going to keep that filament pressed up against those drive gears. Other than that, make sure you place your serial number sticker as well as your warning sticker on your MMU3. That serial number is pretty important in case you need support going forward. Now we move to the buffer assembly. These are the buffer plates. There's going to be 6 of these. They do have a plastic coating on them that you need to peel off. But you'll have 6 because we need 5 different lanes for the filament to back out into. So we'll go ahead and pull all the plastic off. It is important to note that there is plastic on both sides. So this is going to take a minute. Plastic is off. That's actually my least favorite task of this whole build. But then we can move on to assembling some of our printed parts. So this is the cassette frame. This is the buffer leg. So we're just going to insert that here. Just press that in. Then we have some square nuts to deal with. We've got 2 down here. You can press those in with your 2mm wrench. And then we have 2 over here on this side. All of those buffer plates will line up in these slots. And then we have the other leg that attaches it onto the printer. This part hooks around the bottom of the frame. But you have some square nuts in there as well. 1 there, and 1 there. And this part can be kind of a handful, but if you do it in the right order, it's not so bad. So we have to load all of these plates while not losing all of our square nuts. So that's what makes it really challenging. But the plate is going to go in just like this. And we can try to set the plate flat, again, without losing your square nuts. And that leg that attaches to the printer, the square nut side, this first slot, will go in right here. And after you have that started, then you can flip the whole thing over so that it's standing as it would stand. Be careful, like that. And then we can try to continue lining up all these plates. You're going to kind of have to hold it in place while you get all this done. It's kind of like building a house of cards. We got 2 in. There's 3, 4, and we'll worry about getting this lined up here in a moment. We should be able to just slide that down after everything's in. 5 and 6. Make sure this side is flush with all of those. Again, we'll worry about this in a second. And I'll spin it around so I can show you, but the goal is to get our first M3x30 screw in here so it kind of holds it together while we build the rest. And we'll start with this one up here. So there's going to be an M3x30, 1 on each side coming in from both directions, but we'll get this top one started. There's no reason to get those too tight. You will deform the plates if you do, but that 30 should get you over to the center square nut, the one on this side, and then there'll be a screw again going into that other square nut. So 3 of the plates are secure, but let's go ahead and put this one down here in the bottom. And I'm also going to go ahead and sink the other one over here on this side. So at least that I can have all 6 of the plates kept while I'm working on it. So this way, with those top 2 in, if you're having problems with any of the square nuts, like I am on this one here, you can still flip it and reseat that nut. Usually gravity will do it for you. But at least you can get that done without the plates falling out. So we got the one on the bottom there done on this side, and then there'll be one over here on this side. And with those 4 in, 2 here, 2 on the other side, it's much easier to land the foot that connects it to the printer. So when you have that lined up with the holes, the outer one, M3x30, so that'll get your 3 outer plates fastened, and then you kind of have to flip it around here. You have a hole on the side that allows you to put in that last M3x30. Kind of have to go at an angle again, where your ball-ended wrenches are going to help you out. And it's important you don't try to flip this thing around, because if you flip it and try to put that screw in from another angle, you're going to lose that square nut. But with that tight, now the really challenging parts are over. But once that's done, do make sure that everything's seated. You can see how that's pulled just a bit. That's probably a little too tight. But make sure they're all seated in the part, as well as on the other side. And then we should have 5 of these other printed parts that are retainers that you can just snap on the exposed holes. So here, they'll just snap into that hole. No screw needed. One there, that one on this side, one here on the opposite corner. This one's actually best from the outside. Same with this one down below. There is a hole here, you can skip that for now. And then your last one goes down here, opposite the foot that holds it on the printer. There, now all 5 of the retainers are on. So there's the body. Now we can move to the cassettes. And there's a lot of parts here. There's 10 of these outer portions for the cassette and then 5 of the wheels. But most of this is rinse and repeat. So we need one cassette, complete cassette, for each material. So 5 total. So on all the wheels, they'll have a bearing that presses into the center. This is a 5x693, but it'll just press into that printed part. I like to just flip them over, actually, and press down on the part side. They need to be flush on both sides. So we'll do 5 of those. All 5 of those are in. And then on half of your cassettes, 5 of them, you'll need some hex nuts. So each one will need 3. Remember, all the parts are identical, but in these 3 holes, we need to press in a nut. You should be able to just press these in with your thumb, but if you need to, you can seat them just a little bit more with a screwdriver or one of your wrenches. They're pretty easy to push in. So land 3 hex nuts in 5 of these. All 5 now have the hex nuts. We'll flip them over, and we can load the wheel. So the wheel will just set in here, and then you'll have a 3mm shaft that goes down through the center, and you'll press it into that printed part. It does sink down into that part a couple of millimeters. You don't have to use a lot of force, but that'll let that wheel spin on that shaft. Then we can take one of the parts without the hex nuts and put it on top. It presses on that shaft as well. Make sure it's lined up. Remember, all these parts are identical. But in the countersunk side here, that's an M3x6. It just screws into the plastic on the other side, like that. And then we'll flip it. And we'll add an M3x6 going the other direction into the other side. I like to put those 2 in first. Now we know everything's lined up. We can spin it back over. We've got the hex nuts on one side. These 3 holes here also take an M3x6. All the screws are in, and then on the end here you have a collet that goes in for input and output in those 2 holes. Those will be in the same bag. You can just squish them just a little bit and they'll fit in these holes. You have one there and one there. So that's going to take that PTFE tube. So when the filament path comes around that wheel, and then this is the cassette, so you can just squeeze on it to release it from the buffer to load it. You'll see more of that. But now we have to repeat this for all 5 of these cassettes. Now all 5 of our sandwiches are complete. Not all that tasty, but we've got all the cassettes done. They're ready to go in the buffer. I do recommend using a low torque driver of some kind if you have the means. It will really save your hand when you're doing multiples, things like this, when you have to put all these screws in. Just be careful, don't over torque them. So back to our buffer body, we can load in all our cassettes. They go in this frame here, and they just slide in. It doesn't really matter. You can keep them all the same, uniform if you'd like, but they just slide into the frame, and they clip in, all 5. Number 3, number 4, and number 5. You will see as we get everything set up, it is important that you keep 1 through 5 in order as it plugs in to the MMU3 as well as it takes it off of the spool holder. For the buffer to work correctly, it is very important where the filament is loaded and where the filament comes out from. Now you have those additional 5 PTFE tubes we talked about before. The ones coming out of the back of the MMU3 are identical to these, but these are intended for you to load the filament into. They need to go in the top PTFE coupler up here. These come off the spool holders. You'll see that when we get it loaded. Shouldn't have to press too hard to get these in there. And then when we're ready, the MMU3 tubes will load here in the bottom. That's just to give the filament the proper arc as it goes through the buffer to be able to keep a nice loop as it's pulling it out, putting it back in, all that good stuff. And just to keep everything nice and neat, about 200 millimeters or so down on the tubes, I like to put on one of these clips. It can go on either way, but it'll just snap on to keep everything sorted and lined up 1 through 5 like we need it to be. So there's the buffer. So our MMU3 is ready to go, our buffer is complete. Now let's go ahead and jump to the printer side, what we have to do to get this installed. There's a few parts we need to update. And before you get started, make sure the printer's cooled down, the filament's been removed. We're going to remove our sheet. I also recommend bringing the X carriage up to about mid-level here so that we can get to the control box. We have to open that up, and we're going to work on the extruder a bit. You don't want it all the way down. So get the printer ready. We'll go ahead and open up our board case. There's just a screw over here on the other side that'll get the door open. The cable we're mostly interested in is the filament sensor cable, because we are going to have to pull it out just a little bit to get a little bit of slack to install our chimney. But it's this red, white, and black braided one here. If you have zip ties holding everything together, you might have to clip one or two of those, but it goes down into this port. This is the P3 port, I believe they call it, but just pull that out, make sure it's loose. So if we do have to pull on it any, we can pull it through just a little bit. We also want to loosen up this retainer here that holds the wires at the top of the board case. Just these two screws, and you can remove that clip. And then at the back of the hot end carriage here, the tool head, we're just going to cut these 3 zip ties. Again, just so we can move that wire if we need to. Careful. You don't want to cut any wires while you're removing these. So that'll loosen up our wires a little bit, but we're also going to take off the back plate here because that does snug up the wires. So we'll remove the 4 screws holding it on. Keep track of where all these went. We don't have to take a lot apart, but it's enough. You want to keep it straight. Remember, the Prusa manual for all of this shows you all the links and all the things you have to do. That should be your source of truth. But we'll take one in the center loose, and then there's one down below. Over on this side, right there. That way we can pull this cover back a bit. It doesn't have to be real loose, but just enough in case we have to move that filament sensor wire. We don't want to tug on it and pull any of the pins. Now we'll flip around to the front. Now we have to replace some of our filament sensor parts here on the extruder. So the first one, the filament sensor cover, is just a screw here on top. We'll take that off and set it aside. And then our extruder door for the idler section, so it's spring loaded, there's a screw over here. So we're going to back that out. Remember, that's what sets the tension, so there is a spring there, be careful. We'll pull that out. That should allow you to open this door. You can see it there. And then there's a screw right here behind, right there. It's a longer screw. That's what hinges this door. So we'll back that out so we can remove it. A lot of this stuff is going to be reused, remember. So there's that. The door is off. Now for the filament sensor, this one's kind of tricky because the screw is very small. It takes a 1.5 millimeter wrench, but it is just screwed into the plastic. So we're going to back that out. Do not lose that screw. Those are kind of hard to find. And then with the actual filament sensor, try not to touch it a lot. We're just going to hold on to the PCB and unplug it and set it aside. Move the camera down a bit so you can see this, but there's 2 screws that hold the body together, one on each side. So there's one here. We're going to back that out just until it loosens up. And then there's one on this other side right here. I know it's hard to see, but that one. So we're going to back it out. And then finally, there's a screw on the other side where we took that long screw out for the hinge. There's an identical one over on here. These both go into this motor on the other side, but that's the final one through the back that we want to back out so that it gives us a little room to work with this housing. With all of that removed, we should be able to just sneak the part out that we need to remove. You should be able to just loosen this up just a little bit. You can see how now there's a bit of a gap. We don't need a whole lot more than that. We don't want to have to take apart anything too drastic here, but we have to get this center section out. In the Mark III, this is what holds that steel ball for the filament sensor. We don't need it for the MMU3. So you can take one of your smaller wrenches and just kind of push up on that part from underneath. This is hard to show, but you should be able to open up a gap and get at that part. Be careful, there is a ball in there in case you were to ever want to reuse it. But you can lift that part out and then remove it. And once that's out, we want to make sure that we pull the IR sensor, the filament sensor wire out. You need about 6 centimeters from the top of the body here to work with. So just kind of ferret that through. You've already undone all your wire restraint. You should be able to pull on it just a bit to get enough length to get into that new housing. This should be more than enough. So everything's taken apart that we need to. We're getting ready to go back together, but we need to talk about this tube. You get a couple of spares in your MMU3 kit, but what this is, it goes from the bottom of the extruder gears all the way down into the hot end. This is a consumable part. It is very important to MMU3 success. This gives you a cold zone to back the filament out into so that you can shape the tip so it's ready to come all the way out and then come back in. If this tube right here isn't in good shape, you're not going to get good filament tips. And it is consumable. So we have to swap it out once in a while. But since you have everything already taken apart, you would just have to go a little bit further to be able to swap this. It's in a clip down inside your hot end. So if you're already here, your machine's got a lot of time on it, consider swapping out this tube. I will repeat it. If this tube isn't in good shape, you're not going to get good filament tips. These are a very specific length. They have chamfers on them. It also has an ID of 1.85, so it keeps that filament confined. So again, a unique part that needs to be considered. Now, these are the printed parts that are going to go back on the machine. This one replaces the ball holder we just removed. It doesn't have a hole for that. You'll see that here in a second. We have a new idler door with a filament sensor flag on it. And then you have the chimney, the higher chimney where the filament sensor sets in. And then we have this new part with a brass fitting. This is where the Bowden coupler goes, but it's also adjustable so that we can adjust the sensitivity of that sensor. All these parts come with your MMU3 kit. You shouldn't have had to print them. So from here we can use our adapter that came with the MMU3 kit. It's keyed. It's just going to drop in the top here to fill the gap for what we just took out. Then we can go ahead and put these two screws back here from the front. One on that side, the one on that side. And then the screw over here that goes into the motor, the longer one, you can go ahead and put that one back in. We need to leave this one open because we're going to replace the idler door here in a second. Then we can prep our new chimney part. This one will need a square nut in the bottom. This is where that adjuster screw hooks onto to be able to slide it back and forth. And then we can build the rest on the printer. The biggest challenge we have is routing this filament sensor wire, but there's a spot on the bottom of the slider piece, the adjuster piece. The slot where the washer goes for the adjuster, there's a screw that runs through here, goes this direction, and then there's a gap underneath it for the wire to go. So it just sets on there. And then your chimney is kind of the same way. It's got a gap in there in the bottom. Through that channel is where the filament sensor wire has to run. So as we're kind of sliding it on, because this part kind of has a track to it, so it has to straddle the sides of this, so it just slides in like this so it can adjust. Just mind that wire, make sure it's in the track, and then you can pull it up and it'll plug in the top here. Then we can do our M3x18 on top to hold this. This is what sets it after you adjust it. It sets in a slot up here so it can go, again, left and right. We'll make it snug, but we won't tighten it up because we still need it to move left and right for adjustment. After that, after the adjustment is complete, then we can tighten up to hold it in place. Then we have an M3x30 for our adjustments to go in the side here, and we'll snug that up. We want to bring the chimney all the way to the left for our starting calibration. So that's where it'll start. We can adjust it from there. When that's snug, you can see in this top slot here, you won't be able to see that screw head anymore, so that's where you want it. And then you want to put an M3 washer, this is kind of a fender style washer, it's a little bigger, in that slot. You can push that down with one of your tools. But that keeps the screw in place so that it can push this forward and move this back as it needs to. So the screw won't move with it. But through the hole in that washer, you can still adjust it with your wrench. We'll go over the adjustments during the calibration section. Then we're going to take the actual filament sensor and put it back here in the chimney. And then I didn't show you this a moment ago, but there is a filament sensor cover printed part. This should come with the kit. But it just goes on top, and then you reuse that 2mm screw, that little tiny one, to put everything back together. It goes back through that sensor board. And make sure it's pretty snug. You don't want the filament sensor moving around. You can kind of check that by touching the pins over here on this side. Make sure they don't move, so it's nice and solid in there. And then your filament sensor wire has a clip on the top. That should be on top of the housing here. So the plug goes this way. The red wire towards me, this is 5V over on this side, ground over here. So it plugs in just like this. And then make sure your wires are tucked into that printed part, out of the way, and you should be good. Now we need to swap out our old idler door with the new one because it has the flag on it. This gear needs to come off. I just use a 2mm hex to push the pin out of the printed part. Be careful. There are roller bearings inside here. You don't want to lose those. Check it, make sure there's grease, but however you took it out, that's how it's going to go back in. So it goes like this. The teeth are in my hand, but it goes back exactly the same way, and you can put the pin back in. Make sure that pin is in just a little ways. It needs to be just a little bit more than flush in that printed part. So you can take a look there. There's also an M3 hex nut. I just get a little longer screw and pull that out of the door and then put it in my new door. This is what holds that tension screw. You want to make sure that that is seated all the way because that tension screw will pull on it and it will actually add more tension than you need. So make sure that's in there well. Now that our gear's been swapped and we've got our hex nut back in there, it can just go back onto the printer. Remember, we have that screw that comes from behind that acts as a hinge, so that goes back in. No need to get carried away tightening this one up. You don't want to squish the plastic so that door can't move. Just snug it up, make sure the door still moves. So we're good there. Then you can take your tension screw, come back in from the side and screw it into the new door. Same tension on this as it would be on single filament. Just make that screw head flush with the side of that printed part. That's just about right. And then we can go ahead and attach the back. This is the part we pulled off to make sure the wires were loose. Go ahead and attach those 4 screws. Those are M3x10, so one there, another one up here, and then one down here below. So that puts everything back together. Now you can go ahead and put new zip ties on your wire loom. Remember, when you're putting those zip ties back on, they go on a very specific way so they don't hit anything while the printer's in operation. I like to bring the top ones in from the left side of the machine. If you loosened up the bottom ones, replace those as well. I didn't because they're kind of independent, but I bring those in and leave the head of the zip tie up here on top. And we'll put all 3 of those on. The biggest thing you want to avoid is just to not have the zip tie on the side because it could collide with something and skew sensorless homing. When those are back on, you can go ahead and reinstall the keeper on top of the control box, as well as if you removed any of the zip ties, you can put those back in. And we'll wait to plug our filament sensor back in and close up shop because we have to plug in the MMU as well. From here, we can go ahead and set our MMU unit up here on top. You want it pretty much in the middle of the printer, and then the legs here, the mounting legs, will actually snap down under. These also have a function that you can lean the MMU up like this so that if you had to work on it, it's a little easier. But in operation, you want it down like this. We're also going to have to clip our control box door just a bit. So we're going to back out this top hinge screw. I've already done this, but I'm going to show you it so when you have to do it. So you can just pull the door and leave that bottom hinge. But you can see how the corner of that door has been cut. This is so you can allow those MMU wires to run into the top of the control box. This is what the door looks like before you clip it. So you just need to clip off. You can probably use your side cutters or your needle nose. Clip off a section there so there's room to run those MMU wires. Once you've made that adjustment, you can put your door back on. That will allow your MMU wires to run down to the box. I like to keep them behind my extruder loom here because these don't move. So we'll run it in like this. And then we can make those connections. These boxes are always very cramped, but you can see in here, these are the pins with the orange shroud. That shroud is a printable part that can help you plug these in, helps you keep them straight, but that's where your MMU data cables go. So the filament sensor wires, the ones we unplugged so that we could get some slack, those go on the bottom row of pins. The red wire goes to the outside of your board. So they go in just like that. You can see that top row right in there, it's still exposed. That's where your MMU wires go. Remember, if you're doing this on a 2.5, the wires are probably going to be a little bit different because the pins are different, but it should look like this. And then your MMU data wires, the blue one will go to the outside. It's not the first pin, but it slides in right on top, and it'll look like that. Just make sure that blue one's on the outside and the red one's on the outside, and you should be good. Make sure they're nice and snug. That's the number one problem that I see if things aren't going well, is these cables or the pins aren't quite lined up or you missed a pin. That orange piece I showed you can really help. But it's not going to work if you don't have that cable right. And then we can hook up the power. The power wires just have these spade connectors. These are going to go on top of the existing power wires. So we're going to back out the lug, and they're going to be hard to see, even harder than the last cable. But we want these two here closest to the frame. They're Phillips head. We'll just back those out. And you don't have to remove the existing wires if you can keep from it. Just make sure you're doing positive and negative in the right order. The positive one is the one closest to the frame. So this one over here. So the MMU positive will slide under that terminal on the existing connector for the printer. And then right next to it is the negative. And just make sure all the connectors are seated. The one above for the MMU and the one below for the printer. So check all four, make sure they're all seated correctly, and that's how your MMU is going to get power. Try to do a little bit of wire management if you can, but that's all we need to do inside here, so we can close up shop and install the door screw. When you're closing the door, make sure it does close all the way, that there's no gap in here, and that you're not pinching those wires, that you've cut a big enough section out of the top of that door so there's room for your MMU wires. So we've done a lot in this video. We completed the assembly of the MMU3 unit. It is now on the printer. We also assembled the filament buffer. It's almost ready for filament, and we swapped out any parts that we needed to on our Mark III to get ready to accept that MMU3, mainly around the filament sensor housing. We've also got it connected up to the main board. The main board is now closed. We're almost ready to start testing, but we have some things to do with filament. There's a lot to talk about there. We've got to assemble some spool holders. There's more than enough work to do for an additional video. So that will be it for this one. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you really soon on the next one.